Part 5 of this course describes the early civilizations of South, Southeast, and East Asia. We've taken a geographical shift into an area that archaeologically is very much less well known than the Eastern Mediterranean world. And as such, it's less familiar to the average layperson interested in archaeology, which is why I'm rather excited to bring it into this course on human prehistory, because this area, with all its interconnections and flourishing, often flamboyant civilizations, was of critical importance to the ancient world as a whole. In this lecture, Lecture 25, I'm going to take you to South Asia, where we'll describe the beginnings of the Harappan Civilization, which flourished in Pakistan's Indus Valley before 2500 BC. I'm going to explain how maritime trade with Mesopotamia was one of the catalysts which led to the development of this indigenous Harappan civilization and its cities. And then I'm going to analyze in some detail a civilization that was very different from those of Mesopotamia with its patchwork of city-states. Here was a civilization which covered a large area, controlled it loosely, and was very different from either the rather standardized civilization of Egypt or the rather chaotic city-state-oriented societies of Mesopotamia. I'm going to analyze the cities themselves, the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and analyze the ancient religious beliefs which may have been ancestral to modern-day Hinduism. Unfortunately, we don't know a great deal about them, but there were some tantalizing clues. And then finally, I'm going to look at the collapse of the Harappan civilization. We don't look a great deal in this course at collapses, and the collapse of the Harappan was probably a combination resulting from environmental and other factors, and it's a good example of the volatility of the world's early civilizations. Now, in Part 5 of this course, which deals with these African and Asian kingdoms and states, we're looking at a world that was really closely linked by long-distance trading routes, especially after the Christian era, during the last 2,000 years. But to begin our survey, we've got to go back to much earlier times, to the rise of the Harappan civilization in Pakistan's Indus Valley after 2600 BC. Let's make one important point right away. South Asia developed its own distinctive civilizations, marked by their ability to assimilate ideas from outside and turn them to their own use. But these distinctive societies with their own local institutions came in part from the very nature of the geography of South Asia. There were natural boundaries formed by the Himalayas and other great mountain ranges. There were boundaries caused by the often rough waters of the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of the Ganges. And then there were the boundaries of tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia. As far as we know, the Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan, in the western part of South Asia, was the cradle of South Asian civilization. This river, which rises in the Himalayas, has a vast alluvial plain, which provided soft, easily turned soils for simple subsistence agriculture, which began in this region well before 6000 BC. We don't know the exact date. Many sites are mantled by later river alluvium. Did agriculture develop in this area indigenously, or was it introduced here? Most experts believe that both farming and domesticated animals were probably introduced from the west, from somewhere around Mesopotamia, at an unknown date. Why? Simply because there were trade routes, exchange networks, extending far to the north into Baluchistan and Afghanistan, and to the west to the Iranian plateau, even before farming began. But here, as elsewhere, farming took hold and was very successful. Within 2,000 years, dozens of village farming communities flourished throughout the Indus Plain, which was a good place for agriculture once you had adapted to the very hot summers and the irregular floods of the Indus. Like the Nile, the summer floods of the Indus fertilized the soil, and the soil could be easily cultivated with extensive irrigation canals and floodworks. People lived in settlements built above the highest flood level. We'll return to the issue of the Indus floods a little later on. Now, many of these larger villages actually had planned streets and were fortified. Now, whether these fortifications were against flood or against raiding neighbors is something we don't know. But we do know that between about 3000 and 1500 BC, the natural tree and grass cover on the Indus Plain changed radically. The native vegetation vanished in the face of expanding agriculture, goat herding, and wholesale wood burning for charcoal and for the baking of bricks. Much of this natural plain was denuded of its natural vegetation with disastrous consequences for erosion control. One of the great untold stories of human prehistory is the insatiable demand by humans for firewood. Firewood you always need for warmth, for cooking, and so on, ever since the invention of fire. And with permanent village settlement and then city settlement, clearly the woods and forests around these settlements are going to be cleared very rapidly. So there was this constant demand for firewood, which often had to be carried in from considerable distances. And of course, charcoal, which makes good fuel and is certainly useful in furnaces for smelting metals, added to the demand. And in this area, like in Mesopotamia, like in Southwest Asia, there were major changes to the environment which were not necessarily beneficial. For example, the floods of the Indus had always been unpredictable and sometimes were very violent. Now there was little vegetation to check the waters in years when the floods were higher than usual. So the people who lived in the villages and towns on this floodplain had to respond with sophisticated floodworks and extensive irrigation canals. At the same time, human populations, thanks to farming, were rising fairly rapidly, not only along the banks of the Indus River, but along the shores of another major waterway, the nearby Saraswati River, which is now dry. Now, this was not an easy environment. Compared with the Nile, it was exceptionally demanding. Long, hot summers, uncontrollable floods, high population densities, erosion resulting from flood. The problems went on and on. And we believe that this sort of environment required intense cooperation between the people living in different households and different communities to maintain flood and irrigation works. And it seems that over the centuries, kin leaders, local chieftains, village headmen, and priests played a leading role in efforts to irrigate the soil, control flooding, and generally make life more effective, more livable, and food production effective to feed a growing population. And out of this big matrix of different factors, sometime during the early 3rd millennium BC, there was a period of explosive growth on the Indus Plain. The villages became towns, and the towns became cities. But at the same time, there was a major shift, apparently, in trading patterns. Hitherto, there'd been trade with the highlands of Baluchistan, maybe a little bit with the Iranian plateau, and a great deal of local interaction because, like everywhere else, interconnectedness was one of the keys of survival in a very demanding environment. But now, the people of the Indus came in direct touch with people living in the Persian Gulf, and they came in touch with Mesopotamian civilization. This trade was conducted by sea. What boats were used for this trade, we do not know. But it seems that the trade was conducted by coasting from the Persian Gulf down the arid shores of Baluchistan to the Indus. And there was a port called Lothal at the shore, on the shore of Gujarat, which was one of the ports where these ships came. We know that after 2600 BC, in the middle of this period of explosive growth, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia were obtaining ivory, metals, exotic oils, and wooden furniture by sea from a land called Meluha. Meluha, we believe, excuse me, was probably the Indus Valley region, far to the east. The trade expanded. By 2350 BC, there were even records of Meluhan villages settled near the Sumerian city of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia and at other locations. Now, Lagash was one of the major Sumerian city-states of the day. So clearly, this was a highly organized trade conducted by full-time merchants who had a major impact not only on Sumerian civilization with all the exotic goods and ideas they brought in, but also on the growth of civilization along the Indus. As this civilization expanded and became more sophisticated, the new Indus cities became part of a huge trading network which linked the Eastern Mediterranean, parts of Eurasia, and Western and Southern Asia with loose and ever-changing economic ties. And I want to stress that in this part of the course, one of the big themes is these connections, long-distance trade by sea and land, as the sort of conspexus of the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Asian world got larger and larger and more closely intertwined. The roots of the global economy really do go back to this form of connectedness thousands of years ago. Also a word here about terminology. We're going to talk in this course, in this lecture, about the Harappan Civilization. Sometimes in the literature you will find people talking about the Indus Civilization. It is now known as the Harappan Civilization after the city of that name, and that's the terminology I'm going to use here. By 2500 BC, the people of the Indus Valley had mastered the problems of their capricious environment to a considerable degree. And their civilization now emerged. The Harappan Civilization, named, as I said, after the city of Harappa, developed and flourished over an enormous area of just under 500,000 square miles. A huge region, considerably larger than modern Pakistan, and certainly much bigger than that of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Now, it's a little misleading, this figure. It would be a mistake to think of this vast area as the center of a homogeneous civilization. The core area, where the influence of the great Harappan cities was largest, was about some 300,000 square miles. But in addition, there were many regional variations of Harappan civilization, most members of which still lived in farming villages, small hamlets and villages close to their fields. Life unfolded at the community and the household level. The difference is here that what you got is what I called in a previous lecture a web of interconnectedness, probably of common religious beliefs, certain loose structures of government, hierarchies of settlement extending over this huge 500,000 square mile area. But the actual tight core was much smaller. And it was in these areas, the core area, that like Sumerians, the Harappans adopted the city as a way of operating and controlling their society. The archaeology of the Harappan has been studied sporadically over the last 3/4 of a century. We know now that there are at least 5 major Harappan cities, of which 2, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, are by far the best known. Both were excavated in the 20s, again in the 40s and 50s by the great British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, and there has been sporadic work, and some is continuing at this time, which improves constantly our knowledge of 2 of the most remarkable cities of antiquity. Each of them built on artificial mounds erected at enormous cost above the river flood level. This was not an easy place to build and maintain a city. The largest Harappan city is Mohenjo-Daro, 6 times the size of Harappa and rebuilt at least 9 times, each time building on the earlier levels. It's thought that about 40 to 50,000 people may have lived at Harappa, about 23,500 at, 40 to 50,000 may have lived at Mohenjo-Daro, about 23,500 at Harappa. A large citadel rises at the west end of each city, dominating a grid of narrow city streets lined with standardized brick houses. Mohenjo-Daro's citadel rises 40 feet above the plain and is protected by massive flood embankments and a perimeter wall, which must have been built at enormous cost. The public buildings on its summit include a pillared temple, perhaps where the ruler gave audience to petitioners and visiting officials. There were no very elaborate temples or palaces, merely a ceremonial bath lined with bitumen and surrounded by a colonnade. It appears that ceremonial bathing was an important part of late South Indian rituals. The citadels looked down on a complex of at least partially planned streets. The more spacious dwellings, perhaps those of nobility, merchants, and high officials, were built around courtyards, some even with 2 or 3 stories. Rows of 1-story tenements housed thousands of commoners close to the bazaar and the artisans' workshops. Like Egypt, like Mesopotamia again, society seems to have been a social pyramid. But we still know very little about the Harappans. We do not know the names of the rulers who presided over their cities, nor do we understand the intricate links between the cities and lesser settlements. Of the 5 major Harappan cities, only 3 of them, including Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were the size of Sumerian Uruk in Mesopotamia. While the Sumerians were predominantly urban dwellers, crowded into densely inhabited cities, most Harappans lived in villages. They were village farmers, dwelling in settlements that interacted constantly with their neighbors. Everything points to some form of stratified society and centralized government. But unlike the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians, the Harappan rulers never boasted grandiloquently of their conquests and deeds on palace and temple walls. They seem to have lived unostentatious lives, marked by a complete lack of lavish public display, a remarkable contrast with other civilizations of the day. One is reminded a little bit of the Minoans, who also seem to have been relatively self-effacing. One reason we know so little about the Harappans is that their script has never been deciphered, despite intensive efforts and the use of computers. There are at least 400 pictographic symbols in Harappan script, but we do not know what language they depict. But we do know from these computer analyses that the script was a mixture of sounds and concepts, just like Egyptian hieroglyphs. We also know that some of the short inscriptions designate the names of individuals and ranks. These, if deciphered, would be invaluable because they would give us a chance perhaps to reconstruct royal dynasties. Others served as religious sayings or appear to have been tags on merchandise. Beyond that, at this point, we can say very little. But one day, it will be deciphered, as other ancient scripts have been deciphered. The Harappans were a society of farmers and merchants, of seafarers and menial workers, like every other pre-industrial civilization, with only a teeny elite at the pinnacle of society. In this way, they were no different from the Shang of China, the Maya, the ancient Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, or any other pre-industrial civilization. What do we know about Harappan religious beliefs? We know that these beliefs reflected an unpredictable and often violent environment, with extremes of heat and fast-moving floods. As far as we can tell, like the Mesopotamians, the Harappans seem to have believed that humans lived to serve the gods who caused crops to grow and soils to be fertile. We believe also that the primordial roots of later Indian religion may have lain in age-old fertility cults, which the Harappans indulged in, among others, which provided assurance that life would continue, that the fertility of the soil of the earth would be renewed. How do we know this? Well, minute seal impressions and clay figurines from Harappan sites depict a female deity with conspicuous breasts and sexual organs, who may have embodied earth and life-giving nature for the Indus people. There's another interesting seal too, this time from Mohenjo-Daro. It bears a three-headed figure who sits in the classic yogic posture and wears a horned headdress. The deity is surrounded by a tiger, an elephant, and other animals. Some Harappan experts believe this god may be the forerunner of the Hindu god Shiva in his role as Lord of the Beasts. If this is true, and if the evidence of other figurines and seals is to be believed, the symbolism of Harappan religion bears considerable resemblance to that of modern Hinduism. Harappan civilization reached its peak after 2000 BC. By 1700 BC, the time of Egypt's Middle Kingdom and of the height of the Minoan civilization and the growth of interaction in the Eastern Mediterranean world, Harappan cities were in decline. They were soon abandoned. Their populations dispersed into smaller communities, and the volume of trade declined dramatically, except perhaps in metals. Here we are again with the volatility of pre-industrial civilizations, a rapid rise, a peak, and a decline. And then the civilization, as we will see in South Asia, is eventually replaced by another. In the case of the Harappans, the reason for the collapse is little understood. It may be connected with earthquake events, which caused a major disruption of farming along the Saraswati River, one of the two great rivers of the Harappan civilization. It caused the river to dry up, and this must have had a catastrophic effect on local populations. Many people died, we guess. And Secondly, there may have been episodes of really major flooding. The problem with flooding is that it's very, very difficult to pick up in the archaeological record. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who excavated Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, found some skeletons, which he said were the victims of a flood, right at the top of the site. But only a few skeletons, and those cannot be used really as evidence of flooding. But you have the evidence of a drastically modified environment by production of food production. You've got chronic erosion, you've got dense urban populations, you have earthquakes, earth movements which cause a major river to dry up, and you've got all the ecological ingredients for a major disaster. And what is the only defense in these situations? To disperse into smaller communities. And that is what happened. But these smaller communities were of immense importance because in them were preserved some very important cultural traits of later times, perhaps among them the roots of Hinduism. By 1500 BC, a new crop was growing in India. It was growing in the low-lying Ganges Valley, hot and humid, to the east, a place where the wheat and barley of the much drier Indus Valley would not grow. Rice, as you know, was a very, very productive crop. And as a result, the center of gravity of South Asian civilization shifted eastwards to the Ganges. It didn't happen at once. It happened, as we will see, many centuries after the collapse of Harappan urban civilization. But there was this shift to the east, which was to have momentous consequences for the later history not only of South Asia, but also of Southeast Asia. But by the time Harappan civilization collapsed, a notion, a pattern of civilization was firmly established in India. And it was a matter of time in South Asia before further civilizations arose. And this time they rose with the economic foundation of rice. The greatest legacy of the Harappan civilization may be religious beliefs, the roots of modern Hinduism. But it also laid another terribly fundamental root or foundation for history, and that was the seagoing routes that linked the Indus with Mesopotamia. Of course, when the cities survived, there may have been a decline in this trade, but no one is suggesting that the trade and the contact did not continue, because the contact between these two areas by coasting ships and even over land was one of the ingredients which led to the Indian Ocean becoming such a major center of trade in the Christian era, much later, which, as we will see in the next lecture, was of great importance to the development of civilization, not only in Southeast Asia, but also on the African coast. But here we've looked back at the foundations. We've described the origins of the Harappan civilization in India, and its development in part as the result of expanding trade with the Sumerians of Mesopotamia after about 2600 BC. I've looked at some of the differences very briefly between Harappan and Mesopotamian civilization, epitomized by the large cities and apparently humble bearing of Harappan rulers. We're in a very different world than the megalomaniac world of Assyrian monarchs or Sumerian monarchs, or even later in Southeast Asia of Khmer monarchs. These people may have been very spiritual leaders. And we have concluded that the spiritual roots of Hinduism may lie far back in Harappan times. And finally, we described the collapse of Harappan civilization, due in part to environmental change. And we commented that there's this strategy when a city collapses, which we'll also find much later with the Maya, where people simply disperse into villages. They disperse because the viability of cities and maybe the authority of the rulers is evaporated. But the connections and the ideas were fertilized in South Asian minds and surfaced again in the story of later South Asian civilization described in the next lecture in the course.